You're listening to Inside Public Procurement by Bonfire, a show celebrating the unique stories and heroic efforts of those on the front lines of public procurement. Each episode, we bring you the latest trends, tips, and real stories from procurement trailblazers like you, who work tirelessly to bring positive impact to the agencies and communities you serve. Together, let's elevate the field of public procurement to new heights. Now, pull up a chair and let's gather around the bonfire. Our show is about to begin.
Hello and welcome to the Inside Public Procurement podcast. My name is Omar Salaymeh and I am CEO at Bonfire, an e-procurement solution used by over 500 public agencies in North America. I'm joined today by Chris Sheel, Manager Procurement Services at the City of Vernon. Chris, we met maybe 6 or 7 years ago at a meetup for clients in British Columbia. And I was struck at the time by your enthusiasm during the entire day for the profession, for the field. And I've always learned a lot from you. And I'm hoping that in today's conversation, we'll be able to share some of this knowledge across the procurement space to other procurement professionals who are listeners to this podcast.
Omar, I'm going to say that I've always been impressed by how well you take my direct and honest feedback.
Yeah. Well, you're never shy to share it, which is something I've always respected and something we take a lot of value in. So Chris, it's been a weird couple of years to say the least. Did you end up picking new habits, hopefully good habits over the pandemic? I know we talked about you cycling and you painted that beautiful imagery of the Okanagan lakes, which I haven't had the chance to visit. Can you share a little bit about what you've been doing over the last 2 years during the lockdowns?
Well, my name is Chris, and I'm a recovering workaholic. And that's what you're talking about there, Omar, is that the work-life balance that everybody's trying to achieve, I struggle with it. And a couple of years ago, I discovered that e-bikes were a wonderful bit of technology. And here in the Okanagan, multiple municipalities got together and bought an old rail line. And now it's the Okanagan Rail Trail, and it's world-class. And I can use it in the morning to commute, and I set target goals to get here. So Kalmalka Lake is possibly one of the top 15 most beautiful lakes in the world, depending who you talk to. And I get the pleasure of starting my day with a 1-hour e-bike ride and get to the office and then just tackle everything full tilt. I think the biggest problem is the energy that I get from that. So there's some people sipping their morning coffee and I come in like a whirlwind and I'm like, okay, what's gotten done? Where are we going? What's happening?
Yeah. And so did you find you actually enjoyed cycling a lot more during the pandemic? Was it the forcing function that a lot of us needed to kind of get into a new habit and get exercising?
Yeah, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Initially during the pandemic, I deployed from my home office for a little while until we got a handle on the situation. Our team was involved in infection control and whatnot, so pretty deep. We were back at the office trying to get PPE in a world of scarcity kind of thing. But I guess the habit that was picked up from it was just pushing aside all the old, outdated status quo artifacts that people are holding on to. The pandemic was a crisis that is just a huge opportunity to exploit for those of us that have wanted to do things a different way. Unique time in history. I think you can probably attest to that as much as anybody else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we certainly saw an acceleration of interest in doing procurement in a digital format during the pandemic. It was initially the need that pushed this, but I think there was a sudden discovery, whether when it comes to procurement or just in our daily lives, that a lot of the things that we assumed they're the ways that should be done in a certain way, or we just kind of accepted as the norm, were upended by force. And then we all kind of discovered a new way of living. And I think as we go back into the quote unquote new normal, we'll find that there are just some things that we just learned during the pandemic that are just better. And we're seeing this, and I know we'll talk about this quite a bit today, with the labor movement that is happening across all industries, across the world, right? This is something so significant and fundamental happened that I really don't feel we've fully grasped it yet, but it's just still in motion. And again, we'll dig into this a little bit more. But yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I don't think we'll ever get to procurement because I'm just fine with that with you. Because here's the thing, Omar, is you're a CEO of a corporation. I'm a procurement manager in a corporation. Theoretically, we're part of what people call the system. But both you and I share personal interest in people that are perhaps disadvantaged or the system doesn't favor. So part of what the pandemic sparked, I felt, was this greater appreciation from people about the value of people in general. And that's one thing that I loved about the pandemic. People realized they needed to be nicer and kinder. The world can be a hard, cruel place for people that don't look the right way or fit in, or their job isn't valued the same as other people. I fear as we, quote unquote, come out of the pandemic, that the world's going to turn a little bit harsh and mean again. And I do see some signs of that. So again, I'm just going to say that the pandemic was a crisis. I think collectively the human race has done a great job of absorbing that crisis, is managing it, mitigating it. And I sure as heck hope that we're going to take some of those lessons forward and try to just keep doing better. I know that sounds a little philosophical for a Wednesday morning, but that's how I feel.
No, absolutely. And I think it's always good. We try to talk about this here with the team as well. This is a once in a 100-year event. And so what that means, it's okay to get a few things wrong. And it's okay to learn how to do things differently post an event like this and accept the fact that there is tough times that people had to go through. It upended our understanding of certain roles in society and which is important, which is not important. And you touched on it already. But the best thing we can do right now is to learn the lessons from the pandemic and apply them forward and not let this, suffering and event that, again, happens once in 100 years to go to waste from a learning opportunity.
Yeah. A number of years ago, I worked for a health authority, and I've worked infection control, renal dialysis, but also respiratory. And there was a little thing called SARS that occurred 17 years ago. And there was a lot of lessons learned from that, and very few applied. And it caught this country flat-footed. And it's kind of interesting because I think humans don't often learn the lesson right the first time, but they really nail it the second. And so maybe that's what COVID will be.
Yeah. And so, Chris, even in this conversation right now, we haven't even gotten to the meat of it, but there's a sense of, which is great, right? Because I think it's very telling in terms of the way you think about the world and, the impact that you think we can all make. And that's something we've always kind of connected on. But before we go into that, can you tell us about your quick synopsis of your time in procurement? How did you start? What made you gravitate towards the role? What has your growth journey been in your career so far when it comes to procurement?
I think that's both a good question and a challenge, because you've known me for a while, and I don't know if I've ever had a quick synopsis of anything. But just to go back a little, I started out in private sector, worked in freight and transportation for about 7 years. And then one of my main clients was a health authority, and they brought me inside to revisit and rebuild their logistics. It was very progressive, meaningful work. I moved from that into what they called purchasing at the time. And that was very exciting work. Like I mentioned, you're buying MRIs, respiratory. You learn more about the human body than you ever want to. And then after that, I moved into municipal procurement. And I'm so glad I did, because I guess I want to say the bodies are in your street. You can't ignore them. At other levels of government, there's layers between you and the service delivery. And in a municipality, it's not. You open your door and there it is. And so here I've been for about 12 years, and I moved myself up through the transactional portfolios. And that kind of experience is invaluable when you become a manager navigating the bigger subjects, because you really have to know what can go wrong in order to how to avoid it. And so along the way, I've picked up a few certifications. One of them is a SCMP, which is kind of required if you're going to run any operation of any major size in our business. I'm a PMP, which is a project management certification, because if you're in procurement, you realize that it's all about project management, or a lack thereof when things don't work. And I've just finalized what's called a Canadian Risk Manager certification. And you can't go 5 minutes in this business without considering, evaluating, and mitigating risk. So that's a bit of a blend of my experience, my education, and that kind of leads us to today. And I can basically tell you, I use all of it. But aside from experience and education and the learning on the job, Omar, I'm going to say that probably one of the most important things is emotional intelligence. Back in my 20s, I might have been interested in being the smartest guy in the room. And as I enter my 50s, I realized that how foolish and misguided that is. A high tide lifts all boats, right, Omar? Like, your personal success or mine is almost irrelevant and secondary. I care about the team's success, that of the client. Everything else just sort of follows. So, you asked for a brief synopsis. I haven't given you one. I'm not sure if I've even answered your question properly, but I'm going to say that appreciation for the perspective of others, whether they be a vendor, a client, a sponsor, anybody, is so important. And having empathy for their perspective and understanding it makes all the rest of it easy. So little of what I'm doing these days is about confrontation, because that is such an unnecessary consumption of energy and time. More often than not, the first conversation is about, is this fair? Is this fair to you? What would you propose? That kind of thing. So not brief and probably didn't answer your question, but...
No, it was good. This is kind of what we're just trying to understand, the man behind the words and kind of the experience that will paint a better picture for the rest of the conversation. Now, in terms of your team and what the procurement team at City of Vernon are responsible for, can you give us a quick idea of your portfolio?
I'm ridiculously proud of our people here. It's a customized team. I came here in 2009. There was one manager. They hired me as a buyer, and there was one storekeeper, and we were busy. And then the spectrum of purchasing expanded into the current model, which is procurement, which is origin to disposal, that kind of thing. So not only did the volumes increase, the scope increased. And what we're handling here, we're basically a centralized model. I wouldn't say we're a pure hybrid because we're controlling most spend, certainly over 5,000. And increasingly, we're getting out of those lower areas after having put in controls for clients to responsibly manage that themselves. So here we go. Fire department, fire trucks, RCMP municipal cells. We support prisoner services that's a very unusual area of our work. We have an airport. That's even before we start getting into public works with roads, utilities, with sewer, parks, public works, fleet, recreation services. We're into revenue agreements on advertising. Procurement here is into areas they never would have been before. And I see it as a major show of respect for our capabilities and our abilities. So we're advising clients on some aspects of their business that never would have happened before. And more of it's about bringing about consistency and alignment, bringing a business approach to operations that don't always see themselves as a business. Omar, within here, staff are clients. I call them clients. And it's a customer service that we deliver. Now, I just did a recent interview with the procurement school, and the title of it was called Procurement Services, Regulators or Trusted Advisors. And in our role here in the city, we are regulators. There's a purchasing policy, there's trade treaties. We keep the city compliant. Once we've achieved those parameters, everything else after that is quality, best outcomes, reaching objectives, measuring it. And you mentioned earlier about lessons learned. That's a fundamental aspect of project management that gets skipped. When you finish a project, you go back and you're supposed to look at the good, bad, and the ugly. And I can tell you in procurement, we do that. Like when we finished, what worked, what didn't. And when we go into a new subject or revisiting an old one, it's like a brand new thing. What can we change? What can we update? And it's pretty cool. We've got some projects here that we're building daycares with grant money for desperately needed daycare spaces. And you as a new parent can certainly appreciate that, I'm sure. We're going to get into hiring staff and retention in a little bit. And the thing is you can't hire staff if there's nowhere for their kids to be cared for while they're working for us. I mean, it's a circle of life, right? Everything feeds into one another. So here in this job, for myself and the team that we now have, and that team now is 3 buyers, a stores keeper, and myself, with some contract support from the mothership of finance. That's the machine that we have now. And I just mentioned to you, back in 2016, 1 buyer, 1 manager. So you can see that growth. Some of it was catching up, the increased spectrum, but now we're pushing capital projects that I'm going to suggest are some of the most progressive in North America. Our infrastructure program, the funding for it, the asset management methodology that we're using, being proactive versus reactive, all pretty neat stuff. Because, Omar, who wants to be a schmuck? Do you know what I mean? Like, you want to just keep stumbling over your feet, or do you want to grow and evolve? And that's what we're doing. I'm immensely proud of our team. I train and develop people purely with succession in mind. It is not about the status quo at any given time. It's, okay, here we are now. Where are we going? What do we want it to look like? What do we need to do? A kind of a holistic approach. So was that a short enough answer?
Yeah, no, this is good, because on one hand, it's a good way to show the scope of what a public procurement professional can do and a department can do. And, for those listening, I think it's a really good example of, could be working on airport projects, can work on projects that are helping the community revive, or the most needy are getting the assistance that they need. And you're kind of at the junction between that policy, call it, or initiative at the municipal level and the execution of it. This is where procurement, I've always thought of it as the nexus where the money kind of exchanges hands in the public sector-wise in a very compliant and fair way. But designed properly, it will give you also the best outcomes, because the process has those best practices built into them. And the best, I think, proof of that is if you go and look at larger private corporations, the larger, more organized they are, the more like public sector procurement they become. And so they have the flexibility to do whatever they want, but they set their own policies for purchasing and procurement. That's because these are good practices, best practices that just make sense, and they're kind of imposed on the public sector because of obvious reasons.
You just really nailed something. In the SCP world, or SCMP world, there's been debate between private sector and public sector buyers for years. Some of the private people have said, I can't believe how many processes you people, quote unquote, have to go through. And I say, well, they're good because you're going to have to do them somewhere. You're better to do them at the front end and impose it and have a framework. And Omar, thank you so much for saying that about private corporations, because it's true. They're best practices for a reason.
Yeah, they get you what you need to get, and they help you go through the motions of planning, which planning is the most important part of any project. We're believers in that. We also see it. But I think the key part here, this is where I love your focus on the service and being client-centric, even as a procurement department, because that's when people start wanting to come to the department, because they feel like, I'm going to gain an advantage by going through the procurement path, the procurement office. They know how to buy things better. They can negotiate better. They can set up the contract and advise me on that in a way that is protecting our organization and our needs. And so, the fact of the matter is, whether it's an engineer within the city or somebody at the fire department, they don't really do buying often, at least at the scale that you guys do. And so naturally, you're developing that expertise and you're getting the certificates to help make the best decisions for the city.
Yeah, the biggest deal, I think, is every individual has their own personal risk tolerance or judgment or background. And that's too variable for a public sector taxpayer-funded organization. So we take their creativity, their intelligence, their objective, we put it into what we do, and we help them achieve their objective consistently and effectively and all those other things. So thank you for those comments, because that's exactly it. We don't want people to come to us because they have to. We want people to come because they want to. And the number one thing that I typically do is I qualify what the objective is. And I'll tell you, in probably half the cases, that's not always clear initially, even to them. And you have to say, what does that look like? And part of the way I do that is picture 3 RFPs in front of you, not the written ones, the submissions. What will you value? And then I reverse engineer back to the moment in time we're at. Say, what do we need to do between now and then to get there? And Omar, I thank you quietly all the time for your software, because when I do put evaluators into that software, I know that the outputs and the results that we get are going to be quantified, qualified, and at least understandable until we have a consensus meeting. So
right. Yeah, no, this is good. And so, I'm looking at the time, we're like 26 minutes in, and that's why it's always the talk. But I think it's okay, Chris, because we'll get to the meat of the conversation in a bit. But before we get into that, one more question. Clearly, there's a lot of passion that you have for public procurement, but what attracted you to the field to begin with?
I'm going to answer that, but I'm just going to mention that when you're talking about hiring people, if you don't have the right ideology, they're not going to come to work for you. And that's what you and I will get into in a minute. So what attracted me to procurement was not ideology. It was just the nuts and bolts of getting things done, influencing change, making things happen. And just the pleasure of facilitating things for people. Like you said, that's where that customer service comes from. And who doesn't want to please people? Now, of course, there's an offsetting thing of, no, you can't do that. It's not all puppies and rainbows, of course. But most of us in procurement of my generation, we fell into it. You're going to hear that time and time again. There was nobody else to do it. It came to us from default. And I'm kind of one of those creatures. But I did move from transportation logistics into the buying procurement because being at the back end, I saw so many flaws that I needed to get involved to do something about it. And really, so it's irritation that got me into procurement, irritation with other people not doing things the way I wanted them done.
When you say not the way I wanted them done, and I know where you're coming from, but I want to clarify that. Like, there were things that you basically said, we can get a better outcome if we do it this way, the questions are not being asked or the process is not being...
All of the above. Yeah. Although initially I didn't realize how wide the spectrum was. Initially in logistics, you have a crisis every Friday. And you realize it's because people haven't been proactive. They haven't planned. They haven't buffered. They don't understand how many things need to work for that to happen. And quite honestly, I fed back to purchasing aggressively from logistics. And the outcomes of those conversations was me moving into purchasing. If you want to do it right, do it yourself. And I, of course, did not. I, like others, made mistakes, learned from them, got better. And, our rec services people call fail first attempt in learning. So again, Omar, in my old age, I'm a little more merciful about the learning curve. Perhaps I might have be less aggressive, but that's the gist of it. Now I'm in it because I love it. And it's what I do. It's what I teach others to do. And I just try to keep achieving better value, high quality outcomes that more people share success in.
And that's something that I think in terms of the greater good and the attraction to public procurement, to be able to do something, larger than yourself and affecting the world in a positive way, definitely really resonates with me. But I'm not alone in this. There's also research to support this, done by LinkedIn actually, which has shown that 71% of millennials would actually take a pay cut to work at a company that holds the same values as their own. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll give you a quote. And so life unexamined is not a life worth living. And you talked about the pandemic earlier, or we talked about millennials and their higher quality expectations for life. People need a purpose, Omar. Once they realize it, they can't turn back. They can't do it another way. Some people have to do what they do to provide, but some people, myself included, we need a higher purpose. Again, I'm going to just say that, some people get that through family, faith, and friends. But isn't it so great that you can get that through your work as well, And so that's, I think, the missing piece here. There are studies that once people achieve a certain salary, after that, they're rising up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs where there needs to be more and more and more. And I think that's true. Now, we can get into inflation. I mean, none of that matters unless we're paying them enough. Like we can talk pay cut all we all want, but until we get to a certain number, you none of this stuff applies, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I would say it's implicit in that research even that this is the case. It just draws on the fact that people need something with a higher purpose. And generationally speaking, the workforce now and the future of the workforce is basically very pointed towards this fact. And I think really useful for the rest of the conversation, because when we were talking earlier, we talked about staffing quite a bit and the challenge of either attracting people to procurement. We talked about the Great Resignation and how it's affected public procurement offices as much as the private sector. How do you think outside talent perceives the role of the public sector procurement? And, is there like a better way to tell the story?
We suck at marketing. We don't do the best job of presenting that as a career option. Accountants are starting to do a much better job. They got these great ads that show them jet skiing and all kinds of things. And I think they're ahead of the curve on that. And procurement, we need to do a better job of destroying the myth and getting into the reality, which is kind of what we just talked about. Fulfilling work, you're changing people's lives. It's not just about optimizing profit margin, so they don't know that. And I think they perceive us as boring, bureaucratic, and possibly underpay. And I think there's some truth in all of that historically, but it certainly isn't true here. I won't disclose salaries, but I'll say that we pay a fair competitive wage with good benefits. I and the organization are very focused on the well-being and health, physical and mental, of our people. Coming back to the pandemic, public sector was a constant to its staff in a way that private corporations couldn't be or wouldn't be. And I think after the pandemic, we may be viewed in a different light. I certainly hope that we are. I hope that doing interviews like this will help encourage people, which is some of the motivation other than the opportunity to spend some time with you. Yeah, that's what it is. And I think they think that we're just like lowest price wins. I still hear that. Well, you guys just go with the cheapest option. I say, first of all, who is us guys? Because I won't get into gender, but I'll say that we got a lot of different people in our industry. So yeah, I think we need to bust that myth apart. We need to make people understand that we're about best value and exploring creative ways to solve problems. I mean, expressions of interest, requests for information, negotiated RFPs, Omar, there's nothing fixed and rigid about any of those tools, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're looking always to limit or remove obstacles and barriers. And it's not just because we're voluntarily choosing to. It's because we have to be attractive to vendors in a very busy world. And again, coming back to recruitment, because we've got to be attractive to people who want to work for us. Yeah. So I'm just going to say 3 things that we're looking for in people, despite what they're looking for us in us: intelligent consideration, critical thinking, and a focus on long-term objectives and purpose. We play the long game here. We're just not just a short fix on a quarter, right?
Right. I think this is what makes being a public servant really interesting. Like here in Toronto, they're just starting at least the environmental studies and then soon construction of this massive rail line, sorely needed. And I'm just thinking about the time scale that this will take place over. We're talking like a decade and a half. Surely there are unknowns that will push it a little bit further. But thinking about that decision and how it's made and how important it is for the future of the city and the economy, even of the country, against the approach that we typically see, which is like quarterly objectives and how you can be very myopic when you think in those short term versus the long term. And this is, I think, what makes public service special, right? Because you're building for the future. Politicians come and go, but really the people who are doing the work are the people who are in the procurement offices, who are building that expertise and have their, eye on the long term. I'm trying to kind of sell procurement myself, but I don't think I'm doing a good job as you are, Chris.
Omar, you've never did a bad job in your life at anything.
You're too nice.
No. you've illustrated it very clearly. The more that you can separate the civil service from the politicians, the better it is for everybody. We serve at the will of elected officials, but after we're given a mandate, we need to execute that uninterrupted. And credibility is huge, Omar. If you just came off a successful light rail project, people are into it. If it's a disaster and overruns and it doesn't work, and I follow some of those goings, then you lose the hearts and minds of the people you're trying to help. So public sector is a little cruel that way. Down there, do you think we should call Elon Musk and get that done in 18 months, that thing? Cut it down from 10 years?
Boring, yeah. It's interesting though, right? Like, I mean, this is maybe a topic for a whole different conversation. But I think there were some power outages in Australia a few years ago. And then Elon basically said, if I get this contract, basically, I can have basically a battery system set up in X amount of time. I'm not going to claim I followed that story, but I remember reading they pulled it off. And so, again, maybe a topic for a different day in terms of the creative.
Shall we talk about necessity as the mother of invention and how human beings can be so horrible on the one hand, but when they're challenged and they innovate, they're amazing. And that's what you're talking about there. And hey, there's going to be no lack of crises where we're not going to have a choice, Omar. So I think some of the things that you're hypothesizing about, they're going to become reality quicker than maybe we're comfortable with.
Yeah. And again, not to keep going back to the pandemic, but this is kind of what it did. I think it's all fresh in our minds that, sometimes we have to come up with unique ways that we haven't examined before that get the job done when you need them to be done, especially in a time of crisis. Going back to the recruiting piece and attracting people to public procurement, there's another piece of research that, and this is kind of even common knowledge, millennials are the first digitally native generation to enter the workplace. And I wonder if there's something to do with that perception of procurement from a tech perspective. When so much of what we do is becoming digitized, how do you think this plays into attracting talent to public sector procurement?
Well, you and I met in 2016? I was hired to take over the department. And the first thing I talked about with my new boss was implementing Bonfire. And I did it because I needed to get us out of the transactional busy work. I talked about being one buyer. That's how I amplified output. And back then, while you were pitching the software to people and people were resisting it, I spoke at one of your conferences, and not to promote Bonfire as much to promote the City of Vernon, to say we're progressive, this is what we're using. Now, a couple years later, it became more normalized. During the pandemic, it became more common, and now it's a necessity. So the point I'm getting to is, if you don't have those tools in place already, Bonfire or other e-procurement platforms, whatever they be, people won't work for you. When you've implemented it with existing staff, they're appreciative, they embrace it. If you've got new people who have had it somewhere else and they see that you're backwards, they will take it as a temperature reading on your culture and whether you're progressive or not. And this gets into other aspects of cloud and decentralized workplaces, but you're done. You're done. If you do not have adequate software or not working towards better solutions, the new staff are going to look at that and they're going to go elsewhere. They almost should, because it's only those kind of problems that are going to wake up organizations to say, do we pay intelligent, educated people to do busy work fraught with data entry peril? Or do we want integrated inline cloud software that bulletproofs the nuts and bolts so that we can be intelligent and take the time to make an informed decision in what Covey would call the important quadrant? And that's, I guess maybe I'm a millennial. Am I a millennial, Omar, at 50 something? Like, am I making a case for them?
As an elder millennial, I think we can give the people that label. So I think, I'd say, Chris, you think like a millennial. I'm not sure what that means.
My generation, the only constant my generation has known is change. And being trained in multiple disciplines, I have learned that a crisis or a risk is purely an opportunity. There is as much good to it as there is bad. And the best example, pandemic. I mean, explosive growth in tech companies. Is it just because they were there ready and waiting? No, it's because people needed to do it. And I think we need to keep that thinking moving forward is let's not wait until we're in a crisis to embrace new options. Let's, like you said, plan, be methodical, be disciplined, integrate it into our operations, and the rest will follow.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to your point earlier. If you're using good tools that take away the busy work, you're more likely to attract people to come. And if you're showing them that you're being proactive and you have a plan for the future and you're willing to change things for the better, they're also going to be attracted to that because people sense that in an interview. Now, when it comes to like the source, so when we're thinking, if we're going to attract potential talent into the public sector space, naturally the private sector is an obvious target, right? They've gone through the process. They have some of the key skills. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a viable strategy? And if it is, what would be the best way to go about it?
Well, if anybody is hiring for a procurement position in public sector and they're expecting to get a pile of resumes from experienced people mid-career, keep waiting. They won't come. They won't come for a variety of reasons beyond your control, real estate prices, lack of schools, other stuff. But let's just say that demographics, with the gray tsunami, you talked about it, the retirement bit there. Omar, we need a pipeline of people and they need to come from private sector. It's just a larger well to draw from. And we need to screen them for those things I mentioned. Emotional intelligence, critical thinking, long-term strategic, holistic thinking. Once we've done that, we need to screen them for ethics or teach them a new set of ethics, not to disparage private sector, but there's influence of ownership sometimes that puts people in a bad position. You don't experience that in public sector. Like, if it is not the correct thing to do, I or my team will not agree to it. It doesn't matter who is asking for it. We speak truth to power. And again, that might be an attraction for certain people in private sector that feel they want to contribute. And then this gets back to social conscience and other stuff. So I'm going to come back to say public sector government needs to attract people from the private sector, and it needs to use progressive software to get them into the method of deployment. And then the management needs to really do an immersive experience on culture, ethics, protocols to sort of make those people safe, so that we don't damage our reputation. So I might be going down the rabbit hole there. I'll just say that you've been out there in the market. I mean, how's it going for you? You recruiting, you attracting people? Is it working?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult across the board, right? Like in the Great Resignation as a term has been repeated a lot over the last little bit. And part of that is because everybody's kind of facing the same thing. And part of that was a result of the pandemic and people maybe coming to certain realizations. But the thing that initially surprised me when I first heard about it, that the public sector was experiencing the exact same thing. So yeah, I think collectively we're feeling this. There's almost like a giant game of musical chairs that is happening.
Or chairs on the Titanic being moved around.
Yeah, it just basically, everybody is like thinking whatever it was that I wasn't satisfied with, it progressed to a point where it was a tipping point when they said, I need something new. And some people said to themselves, well, I need something that aligns with a bigger purpose. Or some people were moved by what happened in the pandemic, whether it's like the healthcare response or the fact that, again, industries and departments like procurement all of a sudden came to the forefront. And so now they feel like, you know what, I want to be part of that solution for the future, right? So there's a sense that was awakened, I think, in some people. And that's why I think it's opportune to talk about this now, because people are like loose in the socket, right? And it's how do we then attract them to the public procurement space And how do we present that?
Well, my strategy is, and I listen to marketing, philosophy stuff and whatnot, core values, Omar. People are attracted to companies or organizations that they have the same core values as. And that's tricky for both government or private, but you may offer remote working, profit sharing, but what we're going to offer is a noble cause. Maybe that's my marketing pitch is we'll get you far enough on the money and the benefits. We'll offer you a good, safe, progressive workplace, free of bullying and discrimination. And I say that very passionately. And we will allow you to make a difference in your community and in people's lives. And you will not have to compromise your personal morals or ethics. We will never put you in that position. So, hey, there's my marketing pitch right there. What do you think?
I think it's great. And it's empowering too, right? By the way, we kind of have the same sentiment at Bonfire because we're people who, we're a software company. But what that means is we're also competing with the likes, say, of Google and Facebook and, that world, which is, as you can imagine, very competitive. But the people that are attracted to Bonfire are the ones who are saying to themselves, well, if I'm going to spend some portion of my career doing something, I want to have a sense for impact. And every day, our client team opens up portals and they see the cool projects that are being run by our clients. And then we hear stories through what we do about the transformation and the freeing up of time that then lets humans do what they're best at: research, negotiation, building relationships with other, whether it's vendors or it could be internal clients, and just let the computers do the boring work and to do it perfectly. We will always tabulate the scores perfectly every single time.
Omar, if I try to tell people I sound like a grandfather in a rocking chair sometimes, I said the Excel sheets that we used to use for evaluation criteria and worrying if the formula was right, if you had the wrong outcome, that tightness in your stomach. We don't do that now. What we do is we say, is price 20, 40, or 60? Where are you in your marketplace? So instead of spending that time with those formulas, which will do poorly, AI will do it better, we focus on what will deliver the best company for a best value outcome. So let the computers do the work. I like that.
Yeah. And I gotta say, Chris, early in the history of Bonfire, we're still learning, like this is in the early building phase. We're talking to procurement departments and we would ask them, well, can you show us what these Excel sheets look like, and then we get these complex ones. And I remember vividly looking through one that was of a bit tabulation, 6 or 7 tabs in that Excel sheet, intertwined formulas, and I'm chasing my way around. And at one point, I think I found a mistake, right?
Yes.
And then I went over to my colleague and I was like, okay, do you see the same thing I'm seeing here? And that was a project that had closed and it was, in the history books at that point. But then again, that gave me specifically, I was like, man, this is, first of all, a huge thing that we can fix.
Yes.
And you're going to expect mistakes. All of us who have built Excel sheets know how precarious they could be. And as a reference that when you drag the formula down, all of a sudden refers to some other value is already enough to tip the scales on a decision. So anyway, that's kind of how we think about it, Chris, is to look at the impact that we're having and seeing what we can do through the procurement departments that we serve. But again, this is not a pitch for us, more of a pitch for you guys and how you're kind of using those tools to make hopefully more strategic decisions in your day-to-day. And I know we're a little bit over time here, Chris, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. And I think there's going to be another episode in the future. And so before we close, Chris, every week we ask our guests, what is the number one piece of advice you'd give to people starting their career in public procurement? Thinking of one is hard, right? It's the fact that there's only one that makes it so tough.
I'll give you an official answer of procurement, okay? Do not compromise your personal morals, your personal ethics. Don't be rushed into making tough decisions. People will want quick decisions And sometimes you need to take the time to make an intelligent, informed one. That's my high-level advice to anybody, especially in procurement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it probably applies across the board too, because we're always feeling that rush. That's very wise. Yeah. But before we wrap up, Chris, any closing thoughts on generally what we talked about today?
But, I think we covered most of my important parts in our conversation. I'll just say to people or anyone listening, think about what you do. Like, words matter, actions matter. Picture yourself after you're finished your career. What have you accomplished? I mean, we can talk work all we want and computer programs like we do, but Omar, you do nonprofit work outside of work, right? So do I. I've done it for 25 years. And does someone force us to do that? Does someone pay us to do that? No. We do it because our respective skill sets can deliver that. And I don't know, it gives back so much more than it takes, most days anyway. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to say is people sounds weird, but just really try to live a good, full life. And you spend as much time working as you do sleeping or more. And more than you spend with your family. So enjoy it, embrace it, try to be good at it, and try to help some other people along the way. And that's basically it. And I'll finish off with a thank you to Bonfire and yourself, because I can honestly tell you, and I have been honest over the years, both good and bad, that your software has helped transform our profession. It really has. I mean, there's others in the space, but you share that space and you do what you do well. And I guess I'm going to say congratulations on running the show now.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Well, it's always a great time chatting. Thank you for taking, I know you're very busy, and we were talking earlier about how many projects you have on the go right now. So for you to take an hour of your time to chat with us today is really appreciated. And thanks for the feedback through the years.
Well, always time for you, Omar, and I always enjoy it. And thank you again for quality conversation and the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. It's been enjoyable.
My pleasure.
Procurement professionals like you are the lifeblood of public sector organizations, dedicated not only to supporting your agency, but the constituents you serve. That's why we've created the Inside Public Procurement podcast here at Bonfire, a unique place where you can share stories and discuss the topics that matter to public procurement pros. From digitization and the future of public procurement to ensuring a fair and transparent process, we're all about finding new strategies to help your agency succeed. Join us at gobonfire.com to learn more. You've been listening to Inside Public Procurement by Bonfire. If you like what you've heard, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you have an idea for an episode or want to come on as a guest, email us at hello@gobonfire.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.